While resistance of any kind was near impossible in Nazi-occupied territories, a brave few individuals did whatever they could to fight off Nazi tyranny. Some did so through small cultural and spiritual means, like refusing to salute Hitler or producing secretive writings condemning the regime. Others did so through joining organized resistance groups like the Partisans or participating in armed uprisings. Today, on Holocaust Memorial Day, I hope you'll join me in remembering their stories of resistance and hope.
A story about a young violinist who is remembered for courageously helping others after bearing the loss of his family.
A story about a young woman who was a poet and a party trooper. A woman filled with hope and idealism, who became a symbol of courage and kindness.
And a story about emunah, faith, that brought hope and strength to so many during dark and desperate times.
This is a story about Motele Schlein.
I want to tell you the story about Motele Mordechai Schlein. Do you know him? I first met him in the forest near Koris Ghetto in Ukraine. I was coming back with my partisan brigade from an attack on the German army when I found a beautiful boy, his head resting on a violin case near our hiding camp. What did he do there? Well, after his parents and little sister were murdered by Nazis, he escaped into the forest, all alone in the world with only one thing: his violin. Motele was only 12 years old and a talented violinist. You know, the Nazis also killed my wife and daughter, but I was able to escape with my son, Simcha, and built this freedom fighters unit deep within the forest.
I didn't know what to do. When the Nazis came into our home and killed my parents, my beloved sister, Basiale, I grabbed my violin and ran as fast as I possibly could, as fast as my legs could carry me, until I couldn't run anymore. Uncle Misha found me in the forest, took me to his camp, and I became one of them. They became my family.
Motele, come here. We have a big task for you. We want you to be lookout in Uvuch. We want you to pretend to be a beggar and even play our violin. The whole point is that when you come back, we need to know if there's any Nazi activity. Are you up for the task?
Yes, I am up for the task. How can I resist? I was standing in the street corner playing my violin, and suddenly I was approached by a Nazi officer who ordered me to play at a Nazi soldiers club. I was not afraid of them, but I was sickened by the thought that I am entertaining the soldiers during their daily meals while my people are starving in the streets. I decided to do something that I thought I would never have the courage to do: to bring explosives to the club and blow it all up.
And that is what Motele did every single night. He would go into the basement, hide his violin, and come out with only his violin case. In the morning, he would come back with explosives in the violin case and put them inside the basement.
Uncle Misha, today is the day. A group of high-ranking Nazi officers are coming to the club, and we must act now. I ignited the wick to the explosives, took my violin, and walked out of the building, saying goodbye forever to more than 100 Nazi officers.
My son Simcha was waiting for Motele, and together they escaped on horseback and rode into the forest.
This is for my parents and little Basiale.
A year later, Motele was killed while fighting against Nazis. He was only 14 years old. The only thing left of him was his violin.
To smuggle a loaf of bread was to resist. התנגד מי שהבריח כיכר לחם. To teach in secret was to resist. התנגד מי שלימד בחשאי. To gather information and distribute an underground newsletter was to resist. התנגד מי שכתב והפיץ עלון מחתרת שהזהיר וקרא אשליות. To survive was to resist. התנגד מי ששרד.
To rescue a Torah scroll was to resist. התנגד מי שהגניב ספר תורה. To forge documents was to resist. התנגד מי שזייף תעודות הראיות שהעניקו חיים. To smuggle people across borders was to resist. התנגד מי שהבריח נרדפים מארץ לארץ.
To chronicle events and to conceal of the records was to resist. התנגד מי שכתב את הקורות וטמן בחול. To extend a helping hand in those in need was to resist. התנגד מי שהושיט עזרה לראוי לה ממנו. To dare to speak up at the risk of one's life was to resist. התנגד מי שאמר מילים שקרבו את קיצו.
To stand empty-handed against the killers is to resist. התנגד מי שקם בידיים ריקות על הורגיו. To reach the besieged, smuggling weapons and commands was to resist. התנגד מי שקישר בין הנצורים. To take up arms in streets, mountains and forests was to resist. התנגד מי שלחם עם נשק ביד ברחובות העיר, בהרים וביער.
To rebel in the death camps was to resist. התנגד מי שהתקומם במחנות המוות. To rise up in the ghettos, amid tumbling walls, in the most desperate revolt humanity has ever known, was to resist. התנגד מי שמרד בגטאות, בין קירות נופלים, במרד הנואש ביותר שידע האדם המורד מעודו.
On my 18th birthday, I decided to move. Move where, you asked? Well, the only place on earth where we are not refugees, not immigrants, where we are home. Eretz Israel, I'm going home. It was 1939 when I arrived in Palestine, went to study in the agricultural school in Nahalal. We wake up very early every morning, work in the fields, wash dishes in the kitchen, and it makes me so happy here. But I feel terrible that I left my mother, Catherine, who I was deeply attached to, in Budapest. Now she's all alone because my brother, Giora, also left to study in France. A few days ago, I got a postcard from Eva, my best friend, telling me that she danced in a ball in Budapest. For a moment, I asked myself whether I was foolish to leave my comfortable life and choose a life of a worker. But no, I belong here. I'm happy here in Eretz Israel. I finished school and decided to move to Kibbutz Stayam, where I can walk on the beach, listen to the waves and the wind. But while I'm happy here, I also think about my family because all communication with Giora has been cut out as the Germans were standing at the gates of Paris. And what about Mother? Is she all right? I don't know. I do not hear from her lately. I must go back to Hungary to help my mother, my friends, my people. There are rumors that the Palmach is organizing units designated to infiltrate Europe and help the Jews. They're looking for volunteers. I was not alone. 240 boys and girls volunteered for the mission in Europe. We went through rigorous training, parachuting, weapons, radio sabotage. 26 of us, 24 men and 2 women, were sent on our way to Europe. The time has come. I'm going to place my diary, my notebooks, my poems, my letters to my mom and brother, and deposit her in the kibbutz storage room. I'm going to Europe. Today is March 13th, 1944, and I'm about to parachute over Yugoslavia to join Tito's partisan group, fighting the Germans. We are the only ones who can possibly help. We don't have the right to think of our own safety. We don't have the right to hesitate. It's better to die and free our conscience than to return the knowledge that we didn't even try. Only after 3 months we managed to cross the border to Hungary, and even then, only because I insisted that we should not wait any longer.
In a small village near the border, Hannah was captured by the Hungarian police and handed over to the Gestapo. The transmitter found in her possession left no room for doubt as to her doings. Submitted to horrible torture, she stood brave and proud, did not surrender, or betray her comrades. Even after her mother was imprisoned and the Nazis threatened to execute her, she did not manage to break her spirit, and she did not betray.
My mother came to visit me in prison today. I feel it in my heart. That was the last time I saw her. Dear Mother, I don't know what to tell you. I will only say this. 1,000 thanks, and more. And forgive me, if you can. Maybe another week, or next month, may still find me here. But death, I feel, is very near. It could have been 23 next July. I gambled on what mattered most. The dice were cast. I lost.
Chana Senesh, the legendary fighter, was executed on November 7, 1944, 6 months before the end of the war.
Mikdash melech ir melucha kumitzei mitoch hafeicha. From the memoirs of Rabbi Israel Meir Lau. After the battle for my life, and after I was put in Buchenwald and my brother Naphtali's backpack, I continued to hide most of the time in the hut, while Naphtali worked as a mechanic in the phosphate factory. In the hut, I hoarded some food and provided it to Naphtali when he returned at night after work. Sometimes, in order to escape the anguish that our part in the labor camp had, I would return in my imagination to our first night in Cherstochva, when I first heard Cantor Yosel Mandelbaum sing the Nigun. It was a Saturday night. Naphtali was lying next to me, trying to warm me from the coldness of the dark earth, when suddenly he heard the sound of Hasidic music that he knew from Krakow, his hometown. All excited by the scent of childhood that suddenly spread around him, a memory of so many other days so far away. Naphtali crawled on the turret's soil towards the cantor's voice. The song and the melody were familiar to him. Kumitzei, kumitzei, mitoch ha'afeicha, mitoch ha'afeicha. It was indeed the same Joseph Mandelbaum of Krakow. As a child, Naphtali visited my mother's cousin, Rabbi Ben Zion Halberstam, Zatzkal, the Rebbe of Babov, Beit Sanz. He too, we later found out, perished in the Shoah. Yosel Mandelbaum was a follower of Babov, a cantor in Krakow, and one of the greatest cantors in the world. Years later, my brother Naphtali visited Brooklyn with the Babover Rebbe at the time, Rabbi Shlomo Halberstam, Zichrono Livracha. To the surprise of many Hasidim, the rabbi treated Naphtali with great respect and sat to his right. During the evening, the Rebbe spoke with my brother, and Naphtali told him about Yosel Mandelbaum, who sang Mikdash Melech on a Saturday night at the labor camp in Cherestova, thereby unwillingly making a great contribution to our spiritual lives. He brought us back into the family's heart, even in the grim conditions in which we were in then. It is a pity that we lost track of him in Buchenwald. Naphtali returned and cried for him. The rabbi whispered something in the ear of one of his assistants, and he appeared a few minutes later, holding the arm of a simple-looking Jew with an impressive white beard. "There's Yosel Mandelbaum," said the rabbi, asking the old man, who was more than 80 years old at the time, to sing Mikdash Melech. Despite the 40 years that had passed and all that he had endured, the voice of cantor Yosel Mandelbaum had not changed and remained clear and strong when he sang, Kumitzei, kumitzei, mitoch ha'afeicha, mitoch ha'afeicha. Not only the followers of the rabbi of Brooklyn saw Naphtali before his eyes, but also the oppressed who sat on the damp and cold ground in the hut in Cheskova on one Saturday night, late November 1944.
I'd like to light these 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust, and especially 1.5 million children. This is a very important day for me and us survivors, because each year there are less and less of us, and if we don't tell our first-hand stories, who will be telling the real facts? And it's essential for our future generations to get the information as close to real as possible.
El malei rachamim, shochein b'meromim, hametzei menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashechina, b'malot kedoshim uteorim, kezoar harakia, mazhirim, et nishemot kol acheinu b'nei Yisrael, anashim, nashim, v'tov, shenitbechu, v'shenichneku, v'shenisrefu, v'shenergu, Gan Eden, Tehi Menuchatam, Anah Bal Rachamim, Hastirein Beseiter Kenafecha Leolamim, Utzeror Bitzeror Rachaim, Et Nishmotehem, Adonai, Adonai hu nachalatam, ve'anuchu v'shalom al mishkevoteihem, ve'nomar, Amen.
I just want to introduce Suzanne Rato, who is a child survivor of the Holocaust. And I know, Suzanne, you'll tell us a little bit more about what that means, but I just want to thank you, first of all, for being here today and sharing your story with so many of us. We are blessed to have you today.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Guzik, for having me. And this is a very important something I do all the time. And my mother instilled in me the importance of making sure the next generation knows all about it. And the more we can tell them, and let's face it, I'm one of the younger ones because I'm a child survivor. And once we are gone, there will not be a firsthand storytelling. And it's so important because with every generation, it gets a little bit different, as we all know. So it is a very important time of in our history. And just to start, I was actually born 6 days before the Nazi invasion in Budapest, in Hungary.
Wow.
And in 1944, March 13th was my birthday. And when I was born, and March 19th is when the Nazis marched into Hungary and into Budapest. And in those days, mothers were in the hospital for about a week. So my mother was there all alone and kind of disgruntled with everybody because nobody talked to anyone, and it was very difficult. Plus, my father had already been conscripted into the Nazi-influenced Hungarian military, so he wasn't around for my birth.
Oh, wow.
My mother had spent the last few days at my grandparents', but on that particular Sunday, no one was able to reach anyone, and the whole hospital was in total chaos and commotion. By the end of the day, my mother was able to corner a nurse, and she said, well, the Nazis invaded Hungary that day, and as if that wasn't enough, they established their headquarters on the grounds of the hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
You can imagine the mother of a 6-day-old baby without a husband there. She wondered whether we will be able to get out of the hospital, and if we will, how? Well, as if an angel from heaven walked in, her doctor, who was an incredible humanitarian person and had only a few patients. He walked in and he said, I know your circumstances. I've arranged for an ambulance to take you home tomorrow to your parents. And in addition to the ambulance, I've arranged a sign, infectious disease, to be put on the ambulance. Well, you can imagine what that meant. My mother, she talked about this here and there, and she said, you know what, this was the greatest thing that ever happened. And thank God for the incredible doctor's effort. And this is a good time to say that no matter how many and how much bad occurred, people were mean and evil and all the horrors took place, but there were always decent people. And thanks to those decent people that many of us are still alive. So next day came and the ambulance took us home to my grandparents. And a lot of things were very different from just a couple of days prior. And things were unknown. That probably was the most difficult, that nobody knew what was happening. Although the European war time was already rumbling in the air, but because of the lack of communication, it's not like today. There was no communication and nobody really knew what was happening. So everybody was in the dark, and guns were fired, shootings and all that. And bombs hadn't fallen yet, but things were very difficult. Thanks to the wonderful humanitarian act of another person, we were able to be safe for a period of time. And at this time, I would like to make a statement that is my gratitude, perhaps. Raoul Wallenberg is given more accolades and more appreciation than we can bestow on him. He deserves a lot. But it is important to know that he was sent by his government in July of 44. He was sent to help the Hungarian Jewry. However, in April of 1944, the Swiss consul was an amazing humanitarian, Karl Lutz, L-U-T-Z, who, over the directives of his country, he decided to help the Jewish community by issuing what they called Schutzpass, which is a protective paper, false paper, or more or less a citizenship paper, which designated us to be Swiss citizens. This was a form of protection. And in addition to it, he also designated certain apartment buildings where people lived to be what's called protected houses. So this allowed some of the residents of Budapest to feel a little bit more secure, because they knew that they were protected, and these papers did offer protection. So this was a man who did this against the wishes of his country. And later on, much later on, I found out that he wasn't given the accolades and the honor that he deserved, and found out probably the reason being that Switzerland was a neutral nation and they couldn't get involved the same way, whereas Raoul Wallenberg was sent by his government on official duty.
I see. Right.
This is something, a little bit of history, and I always feel that he deserves double credit because he did it. He and his wife were incredible giving people, and they just did whatever they could to help people, and no support from his government. So this was April, and things were getting difficult and more problematic. And the beginning of May, Adolf Eichmann came to Budapest, because you might be aware that Eichmann was the man in charge of labor. The Nazis had a lot of businesses, they had factories, and they needed workers. And I call them actual slaves because they were building into building materials and ammunition factories. All the Jews that they collected were the workers in these factories for them. And what happened at the beginning of May, Eichmann and his lead people didn't start with Budapest to collect the Jewish population. They went to the countryside. They were feeling a little bit more secure, because where could the people go? They just went into the countryside, gathered quite a few people, and through a selection process, and the selection process was a very important step in their extermination process. On one line, they had people who were strong and good workers. And in the other side, they had people who were kind of weak, not so well, older, and children. When they put all these people in different locations onto the train to send them in cattle cars. I wouldn't even call them trains, probably. Send them in cattle cars to Auschwitz. The people were also designated in areas. The one side, the strong people, and the other side, the not so strong. So as soon as they arrived in Auschwitz, they were separated. The workforce was going into certain direction, and the other unhealthy groupie was being taken directly to their deaths.
They're
They were
done.
gassed, and then the rest of it. And at this point, I might even say, because everybody knows that grandparents and people who went to Auschwitz were tattooed a certain number. The people who were being taken to their deaths right away did never get a tattoo because the Nazis didn't want to waste their ink on them.
Mm.
I mean, some of the, the evil just didn't end. It was
No.
evil on top of evil. And it was pretty drastic. So this was going on starting in the middle of May till the beginning of July. In about 6 weeks, they gathered and transported about 600,000 people from Hungary
Wow.
to Auschwitz. I mean, just the numbers, if you can imagine.
No, that number is just, I remember,
you're
right. 6 weeks. You said 6 weeks, 600,000? Is that what?
600,000.
It's just,
But
it's so hard
we
to
must
imagine.
remember, very hard to imagine, but we must remember Hungary was the last to be occupied. And at that point, their system was very well managed and they were very experienced. So they
were
could
very
do a lot.
efficient, unfortunately. They were
Very efficient. Yes, very efficient. So this happened from May to the beginning of July. And then in the middle of July, Raoul Wallenberg came from Sweden. So he continued the same protection processes, what Karl Lutz began. So my mother and I and her mother, her parents and sisters were able to be somewhat safe. And this was going on. The war years were very difficult because food was in very short supply. And it's important to remember that by the time the Nazis came into Hungary, whatever they did more stringent, more rigid, and more efficiently. One of the things was, whereas in the rest of Europe, it wasn't as rigidly enforced, every single Hungarian Jewish person had to wear a yellow star affixed on their heart. And my mother used to say that she even had to put one on the buggy, on the carriage.
Wow.
And it was a very difficult time. And if today we're talking about, discrimination, this was the height and the greatest example of discrimination. So anybody who walked on the streets had to have the yellow star, so everybody knew, which meant it was a problem to even go shopping. Because if everything in those days had to be bought in little shops, as we know, there were no supermarkets. So had to go to the bakery for bread and baked goods, milk store for milk products, the greengrocery, the butcher, and all of that. So it was a major effort. And not only the Jewish people of Budapest, but everybody else had to go for the same sources. So very often when a Jewish person got in line, which was usually long, they were sent to the back of the line.
Wow.
And often by the time they got to the top of the line, there was no food left.
Wow.
So,
Suzanne, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm just curious, you mentioned your father at the start. Did your father, was he able to reunite with you and your mother at some point?
My father had special privilege because his business, he was in the firefighting equipment manufacturing. And even during his captivity, he was used for his expertise. So he wasn't handled like a real prisoner. He was used for his knowledge. And here and there, he was able to come back and visit. So he could see me a few days here and there, but not on a permanent basis. And
So your mother was the one really going out, trying to get all of the goods to keep you alive and to keep your family alive.
well, interestingly, there was always a decision. You had to prioritize. Do I go out and risk being killed by gunfire?
Oh my
Or do we
gosh.
stay home and perhaps starve?
Wow.
Starvation was often a daily way of life.
Wow.
And, you know, in those days, mothers nursed. So if the
Mhm.
mother didn't have enough food to eat, she didn't produce any milk.
Right.
And my mother always used to say, often there was no food and you didn't have anything. And I, being the optimist person that I am, I always look upon the right side and say, well, maybe because of all that starvation, today I'm a healthy specimen and I'm in good health. So not
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Wow.
But these are the things, you know, the positive attitude and optimism is one way to survive because you had to think that way. So if you want to ask me, otherwise I can tell you so because I don't know how much time we have.
Oh, yeah, we still have a little bit more time. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about, was it because of the protection through Lutz, through Wallenberg, that it ended up that your family did not end up in deportation?
My parents, my family did not, but I would like to get a little further into October of 44.
Sounds good.
Which was the second return of Eichmann when they needed more workers. And he came and everybody who was left in Budapest was called up to a gathering place on a soccer field, which meant that my mother had to leave me at age 6 months with a couple of ladies in the building,
Oh my
not
God.
knowing whether she'll ever see me again.
Oh,
My mother, her two sisters, and her mother, my grandmother, all had to go to this gathering place. And, you know, it's sometimes very hard to even say it. But as they were standing like herrings and sardines, a man suddenly approached my mother and began to shove her and push her away.
oh my
My
God.
mother, of course, had no idea, was she going to her death or where was she going? Because this man just kept pushing her. And in a short time, she arrived at the gate to the soccer field where the man opened the gate and shut her out. And suddenly she found herself just as a lonely soul, which meant she ripped her yellow star and started to run back to where she left me.
Oh,
And this was at age 6 months, my second attempt at survival. So survival is, you know, we always have to turn tragedy into triumph. And my mother was always, as a result of that, I think she always protected me, perhaps more than normal, especially since I was an only child. But that left her with such an impression that at age 6 months, she didn't know whether she'll ever see me again. And here finally we were reunited.
and what about your grandparents and your
My
aunt?
grandmother and two aunts went to concentration camps. They were in Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück. Fortunately, well, let's try to catch up and just to finish the story.
Sure, sure.
The Nazis, when they were in full force, not only gunfire, but bombings were constantly falling. And still the continuation of the priority, eating and getting food or perhaps dying, decision had to be made. But by November, the end of November 1944, they felt that they will have a better control on how to annihilate us more easily. So they opened a ghetto. And at this time, when I say a ghetto, I always, usually when I speak to youngsters, I ask them, how do they envision or visualize ghetto of today and a ghetto of those days? So it's kind of a learning lesson. But my father never went to the ghetto. My mother and I did. And it if things were bad before, this was even worse because there was no food, no nothing, and starvation was a daily way. By the end of November, when the ghetto opened, my father realized that he was trying to always do something and escape and got captured. He decided he was no longer going to find any other solution. He'll have to find something more permanent. Of course, not knowing when the war will end. He went to his former factory where others were running it. He, of course, had nothing to do with it. And they decided to fabricate a metal box for him to stay in. My father was 5'1", so the box was fabricated with little holes to put perhaps at night food through. And believe it or not, my father got into this box and they left it on the edge of a cemetery
Oh my
as if it was
gosh.
a coffin.
Oh my goodness.
And my father, being the eternal optimist and always was living with the where there's a will, there's a way, he was going to survive. And believe it or not, for about 6 weeks, he spent in that metal box with no food, no warm anything in the dead of winter in December, January. And at the end of January, when liberation came, he managed to survive, which was really a miracle how he did it. And it was just one of those things. So surviving is a
Oh.
treasure and it's a very big deal. And as we all know, the Russians came to liberate, and that was began a period of uh, very difficult moments. And because people who were alive in Budapest wondered whether their loved ones who were taken, will they return? And if yes, when? Because all the transportation methods were cut off, and anybody who came back usually had to walk from wherever they were. On my mother's side, her mother and two sisters were fortunate enough to return by April, May of 1945, because
Wow.
they had to walk from Germany
Oh
back
my
to
goodness.
Hungary.
Oh my goodness.
And they walked during the day and they stayed under a closed door shelter, and sometimes people gave them something to eat. And it took a long time. So fortunately, they were able to return. But at this point, I might make a very interesting, important comment. As many people as survived, and it wasn't enough, of course, people, even after survival of liberation, many of them died as a result of overeating. Overeating, in a sense, that for months and months and months, they didn't eat anything. Their constitution couldn't handle the
Wow.
amount of food because they couldn't get enough food and all that. So that was a very difficult, bittersweet moment for families waiting for their loved ones to return. And on my husband's side, my father-in-law and his brother were marched on one of those death marches to Russia earlier in the war. And after they were walking back, depending on your health condition, some people also died on the way back. Fortunately, my father-in-law was strong enough, but his brother passed away on the way back.
Oh,
So these were difficult moments to overcome. And it's so important for these kids who are living in the most wonderful United States with everything that you can ask for, to realize what we've experienced and what an important life cycle survival is. And survival is something that we don't just acquire, we have to learn it, we have to strive for it. And it's the human spirit that is able to overcome. And survival and thriving, there's an in between we all have to do whatever we can. And as much as positive attitude and all of those things, and also realizing what we started with, that no matter how bad things were and how many bad people, there are always decent people. And we should always strive to do good to others, because you never know when we will be the needy ones.
So true. It's so true. I just so appreciate you sharing your story. Um, and I think a few things that you said stood out to me, just to highlight for our students, that out of tragedy can come triumph, and we have to remember that. And I think what you just ended on, that certainly there are angels in this world, but we have to look at ourselves as someone else's angel. You know, we are put on this earth for a purpose and a reason. And just as there were angels looking out for you, I just can't even imagine the doctor and this man pushing your mother. As you so beautifully and eloquently said, we too have to find a way to be someone else's angel.
I have a question to ask you, if I may. You being a mother and a rabbi, how do you instill the important idea of knowing about it, learning it from hopefully firsthand, so that hopefully it will not happen in the future for our children and grandchildren? This is such a big subject. How do you handle it?
Well, thank you for asking me. And I think it is one of the hardest questions that I will continue to answer for the rest of my life as a mother and as a rabbi. But I actually think that one of the answers comes from our Passover story. You know, I was thinking about, I was actually thinking about this as we were sitting around the Seder table, that we're not telling someone else's story, but we're telling our story. So, you know, when we think about the Jews that were slaves in Egypt, we're not supposed to tell the story as if it were, you know, us looking at something that happened thousands and thousands of years ago, but we're supposed to look at the story and tell the story as if we were there, as if we were part of the story. And in every generation, it's exactly what we say in the Haggadah. In every generation, we're supposed to tell the story as if we were in Egypt. And in no possible way, in no possible way could I ever imagine a child understanding what it was like to live through the Shoah or survive the Shoah. But I do want to ingrain in every child that I come across, my own children, students at SAA, in our religious school, and whomever I'm in contact with, that this is your story. You are not telling someone else's story. This is the story of our people. So it's not just that you're listening to, you know, a miraculous situation. This is a miracle that happened to your people. When you're speaking
and
about
this is our heritage.
This is our heritage, and this is our legacy. And so if I'm able to lead with that mission, helping our children understand that it's not someone else's story they're sharing, but this is their story that they're sharing, then I think we might have a chance. We might have a chance in understanding the words never again. But it's ongoing. It's an ongoing, it's not a lesson we can just teach once or twice. This is something, and that's why I always think certainly we must commemorate Yom HaShoah, but we must speak about the Holocaust and the stories as you so beautifully did, honoring your parents and honoring your grandparents, both people that survivors and those who did not survive, by continuously sharing your story. I could see your face light up because that's exactly what you're doing.
Well, it's so important to make sure young people know, because only with knowledge do they have a chance to stand up to the bullies and all those who are deniers and those who don't want to admit that it actually happened. And it's so essential for them to feel strong enough to stand up to these people and fight for the Jewish people's heritage and background, because that's the only way we can perpetuate ourselves. And we have so much to be proud of. I mean, we are really the chosen people, if we want to call that. And I hope it will leave the lasting impression on the youngsters that this is a constant story we need to keep up and make sure they are comfortable speaking about it, because it wasn't comfortable for many years for survivors to speak about it. Thank God this worked out beautifully. Most of it was great. Thank you very much. And I hope it'll be a
Suzanne, your story's unbelievable. I will never forget your story. So thank you so much for sharing it with the world, but also sharing it with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and have a good Passover and enjoy the rest of it. And thank you.
You too. Much love to you.
Bye.
Fire.